Hi. Today I want to talk about the difference between responding and reacting and how our understanding of these two things can help make our lives run a little bit more smoothly and maybe a little bit easier from time to time. So let's begin by looking at these words, response and react. How are these used when we talk about them in the English language? Let's suppose that someone is a patient in the hospital and the doctor comes by, that person's your friend, the doctor comes by and says, oh, your friend is responding to the treatment. You'd probably take that to mean a good thing. Responding to the treatment means that they're cooperating with the treatment is having the desired effect, and things are gradually getting better. If this same doctor came to you in the hallway to talk to you about your friend's health and your friend's condition and said, well, your friend is having a reaction to the treatment, you would probably on the other hand, think that that was a negative thing, that having a reaction to the treatment meant that there was not cooperation between the patient's body and the medicine or whatever treatment was being administered. And so think about reaction and response in these ways while we begin our conversation today. When we use these words, we use the word reaction often to describe something that has more potential to be negative than positive. And we use the word response to communicate a different idea, that there's a lot more openness to positive interaction when we use the word response. So let's think about this when we think about our own behavior now. Am I responding to a situation, responding to a comment I may have heard, responding to a circumstance that exists in my life, or am I reacting to it? So I like to think of response as maybe sitting down and writing a letter. I'm fairly careful about the way I select my words. I write it down. I read it over to make sure it's saying what I wanted to say before I lick that envelope, put a stamp on it, and put it in the mail. Reaction I like to think of more as a conversation or sometimes an argument. And often we end up saying things before we think about what we're saying. We've probably, all of us, I know I have, ended a conversation or maybe unfortunately an argument and said to ourselves, I wish I had not said that. I wish I could take that back. But we can't because we responded or we reacted in that situation probably too quickly and without enough thought before we said what we said. So I want to look at 3 ways that responding and reacting are different and hopefully encourage you today to do more responding in your life, in your conversations, in your circumstances than reacting. I'm not saying that a response is always good and a reaction is always bad, but I am saying that if you respond a lot more than you react, according to the way we're going to talk about them today, you're probably going to walk a smoother path in your life. And we're all interested in doing that, aren't we? So let's begin. Response versus reaction. The first way that I think these two things are in contrast to one another is that a response is more often than not controlled, and a reaction is often uncontrolled. When we give a response, think about when I was talking about writing a letter. I'm deliberate, I'm taking my time. I select the words I want to say, I write them down, and then I look back over them again and I say, oh, does that sound good, or is that dumb, or is that communicating what I want to say, or not? And if it's not, then maybe I crumple up that paper and throw it away and in the recycling bin, and then I start over again. I write a letter that's going to communicate what I really want to say. So it's a controlled thing. A response is controlled, it's deliberate, and I take my time. Often being in a hurry is a mistake when we're trying to communicate or when we're trying to figure out what we need to do when we find ourselves in certain circumstances. A reaction, by contrast, is often uncontrolled. Our reaction is often immediately or immediate rather, and we think about sort of in the scientific sense of cause and effect, that something happened and then something inevitably is going to happen after that. And so this begins to build a narrative when we think about cause and effect, or when we think about reactions as, well, there's a phrase we use sometimes, chain reaction. Okay, and a chain reaction means that if one thing happens, it sets something else in motion, which sets something else in motion, which in turn sets another thing in motion. It's that domino effect. And once that first domino has been pushed over, we really don't have any control over what happens with the rest of the dominoes. Okay, so we think about reactions sometimes as things that can get away with us. Okay, or get away from us. They'll be uncontrollable. The second way that I want to think about responses and reactions is in terms of power. I think that a response often has a way of empowering us, and reactions often leave us in a place where we are powerless or where we may feel powerless. Okay, so let's talk about power. Let's talk about personal power and empowerment. When you respond, you are making sure that you are in control. Remember, and I'm going to beat this horse to death, but when I'm writing a letter, I am picking the words that I am writing out. If I don't like those words, I cross them out, or I toss that paper and I start all over again. Okay, but I understand that I am in control of what's being communicated, and I understand that I'm going to be responsible regardless of the outcome. I am making myself responsible when I am in control and when I respond. A reaction, on the other hand, we just in the last little part of our conversation talked about the reaction kind of getting away from us, a chain reaction or the domino effect. And we often, you've probably heard yourself or maybe someone else say this before in your life. They'll maybe two children are fighting and they say, oh, well, they made me do it. And they want to put the responsibility on someone else, as if to say, well, you know, my sister and I were sitting in the back seat and she poked me and she made me punch her in the nose. I would never have punched her in the nose unless she made me do it. I'm surrendering all of my power and giving all my power to my sister, as if to say that I'm a puppet and she is the puppet master and she holds my strings and she can make me do whatever she wants me to do or make me not do whatever she doesn't want me to do. That leaves me in a position where I have absolutely no power over my own actions or my own life, and it leaves me in a position where I can say, I'm not responsible for the outcome. I'm really not responsible for the blood coming out of my sister's nose right now because she made me punch her. Okay? One way of living, responding within the context of circumstances, is empowering to me when I remain in control, when I take responsibility. The other, reacting in the context of my circumstances, often is me just doing something because something else happened first or someone else did something first. And I'm surrendering my personal power, and I am asking you in that case to say, don't make me responsible for my reaction because really someone else was pulling the strings the whole time. That is, as much as sometimes we feel like we'd like to escape responsibility for our actions, that is no way to live. That is a hard, hard life, not being willing to be responsible for your own actions. The third way I'd like to contrast response versus reaction is that when we craft a response to a certain situation or set of circumstances, we are willing to admit the possibility that we might be wrong. We're willing to admit that maybe we could do things better than we've been doing them. Our goal in responding to a situation is growth. I want to grow and develop as a human being. And so I'm open to that growth, and being open to growth has to mean sometimes that I am willing to be shaped, put into a different form, if you will, by my circumstances or by my situation. I have to be willing to admit that I'm not perfect now, that I'll never be perfect, but that I do have the ability and the opportunity to improve along the way, to become a better version of myself, to grow into a better version of myself. Reactions, on the other hand, are often not willing to admit any kind of wrong. Reactions, those quick, thoughtless, chain reaction kind of responses that we want someone else to be responsible for, those are simply, in many cases, our attempt to prop up the perfect person that we think we are, because we're unwilling to admit that we're wrong. We're unwilling to admit that there's room for us to grow. We're unwilling to be reshaped by our circumstances. And so in that case, the goal is not growth. The goal is winning at all costs. Victory, victory, victory. And maybe you've been in discussions, the kinds of discussions that sometimes we call arguments. Maybe you've been in discussions with people before and they absolutely have to win. And they've gone way past the point of making sense anymore. They're just continuing to talk or continuing to yell because they're not going to stop until it's established that they have won, that they got the victory. They are only willing to win at all costs. They're not willing to maybe lose. They're not willing to step away and reflect and think about how they might change or how they might improve themselves to be able to impact their circumstances. So this is just some thoughts of mine regarding responses and reactions. I think the more that we are able, all of us, to move toward responding to situations and circumstances in our lives, to crafting responses when we're interacting with one another, the better off we'll be. If we fall into these traps of reacting all the time, feeling as though we are not in control of our own behavior, feeling as though we're willing to surrender power to someone else, surrender control to someone else, and ultimately looking for those victories, those hollow, I am right kind of moments, instead of being willing to admit, I have some room to grow here, why don't I get busy doing that? So I hope that's been something to think about while you drink your coffee in the morning. Move toward response as opposed to reaction, and you'll see a difference in your life, I think, pretty quickly. Thanks. I'll see you next time.